to the gang, and particularly to you, Wayne. So there you go, Paul.
Hey, Paul. No, that's good. I guess you want me to just ramble on here, or do you want to sort of lead the discussion, AJ, or how do you want to do this?
Well, okay. How about I'll ask questions based on what you're saying, and then if we get to something you haven't covered, I'll poke away at that too.
Okay.
Now, you say you want to make sure you do this if you've got residual sugar. How do you tell if you've got residual sugar when you consider that your hydrometer reading of 1.00 could still have sugar in it, and you'll never really know unless you know exactly how much alcohol you've got?
Well, true.
That's one of those things that's always driven me crazy.
Yeah, you can. Actually, there are some lookup tables, and now there's some online calculators that will, based upon your initial gravity, tell you what your absolute zero sugar endpoint hydrometer reading should be. But it's kind of like on the hairy edge. And you may have some additional fermentable sugars left in there, even at a hydrometer reading of 0.998, 0.996, because ethanol is slightly less dense than water. A solution of ethanol in water it will drop the final gravity below 1.0. So you can't ever really be 100% sure unless you've got lab-grade testing apparatus that allows you to determine that there really is no more sugar in that liquid. So, again, it's always best to be safe, and in order to be safe, you should make your best efforts at stabilizing the product before bottling. And I guess we can talk about the different ways of doing that next, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, that was actually where I was going to steer it next. So how do I go about stabilizing my batch?
Okay. Well, you can do it the old way. And, I'm old school enough to remember when we didn't really understand the concept of stabilization chemically or physically, and we just said, well, we'll wait. And if you leave it in a carboy under an airlock long enough, and it essentially completely clears, if you're careful to rack off only the clear liquid and not take the surface layer of lees at the bottom of your carboy, you can be reasonably sure that it is stable enough to bottle. Now again, if there's residual sugar left behind, sometimes the physical act of racking will stir up enough of that top layer of lees, it'll sort of rouse some otherwise dormant yeast, and they'll start fermenting again. So, most people, myself included, like to follow up that first physical step, that initial clear racking, with another step. And you could choose, again, to do it physically or chemically or a combination of the two. The next step, if you want to keep it purely physical, and then you can advertise that you're not adding any chemical adjuncts or modifiers to your mead, is to cold stabilize or cold crash. You can take that generally clear mead, again, under an airlock, because you don't want to expose your mead to any more oxygen than absolutely necessary during the process. You want to put the whole vessel in a very cold environment. Temperatures down below 40 Fahrenheit, generally most Saccharomyces yeast will go dormant below 40, and all of them are dormant below about 34 Fahrenheit. So if you've got that kind of cold temperature control, and I can't do the Fahrenheit to Celsius conversion in my head anymore, so well, it's getting down to 2 to 4 degrees, something like that. See?
That sounds
if you can get
like what I remember.
Yeah, if you can get it down that close to freezing, and hold it there until the rest of those dormant yeast then precipitate out, which usually takes another week or two, then you have successfully physically stabilized. Then, you rack a second time, again leaving behind the lees layer, and you can be even more reasonably certain that your mead is stable at that point. And that brings us to the chemical means of stabilization, which we'll talk about next. And I know there are, more than a few mead makers who resist using any kind of chemical adjuncts other than nutrients in the process of making their meads, and some folks don't like to do this, but it's almost necessary if you're going to produce a mead with any appreciable amount of residual sugar, or if you intend to back sweeten. And that requires that you add some chemicals to the mead in order to make absolutely certain that all the yeast are either dead or completely dormant. And that generally involves either a one or a two-step process. If your mead is finishing on the dry side, which means there's no residual sugar and you don't intend to back sweeten, it's usually sufficient to just add sulfur dioxide. And the way most home mead makers would do that is to get hold of potassium metabisulfite, and then make sure that with the proper metabisulfite addition, you have the right amount of free and then the right amount of molecular sulfur dioxide added to the mead in order to have complete antimicrobial activity. Sulfur dioxide essentially performs a couple of different functions in meads and wines, and some of them are more important in wine than they are in mead, but if you're trying to make sure that you have no active yeast left, then you want to get a certain minimum molecular SO2, sulfur dioxide concentration, in the mead to pretty well make sure you've killed off all of the yeast that remain. And that's a little bit of a guessing game for most people because, again, if you don't have access to the right kind of chemical assay and titration equipment to determine the amount of free and molecular SO2 in your mead, you kind of have to take an educated guess, and that's a little bit challenging because it's, for those of you who are aware of mathematics, it's a non-linear problem. There's a certain amount of free sulfur dioxide that's going to correspond to an equivalent amount of molecular sulfur dioxide, and the molecular sulfur dioxide number is the one that's really important. If you've got the molecular form free in the mead, it will have the anti-yeast activity, and the amount of molecular sulfur dioxide in your mead depends upon the amount of free sulfur dioxide and the pH. In the old days, we used to scratch our heads and take our best shot and make sure that we were well dosed and in some cases overdosed with SO2, and in order to err on the side of conservancy. These days, you don't have to be quite so conservative, and you don't have to overdose it quite that much because, fortunately, there has been a lot of activity in the winemaking world to determine exactly how much sulfur dioxide is necessary for a wide range of pHs for finished wines, and finished wines correspond to finished meads pretty well in this case. And you can even go online, and there's a link to an excellent set of online calculators to help you determine the dosage for potassium metabisulfite, giving you an equivalent free sulfur dioxide, and then a corresponding molecular sulfur dioxide. And the link to that is right on the GotMead web page, not in the forums, but at the top of the site. There's a link to several different calculators, one of which is an SO2 addition calculator. And so I recommend that people who have not done this before, and even those that have, may want to take advantage of these online calculators, because as much as we've been able to determine, they appear to be correct and complete and will give you the right dosage of metabisulfite to add to your mead in order to make sure that the sulfite has the appropriate anti-yeast activity.
Anti-yeast activity.
Well,
so it kills those little suckers. Yeah.
it kills those little suckers. Now, here's the thing. There are always some outliers. There are some super cells that are always a little bit more hardy than you would expect. And occasionally, even with your best estimates of the amount of sulfite to add, you don't get enough SO2 to do a complete job. If that happens, and your mead is generally on the dry side, it's no big deal, because, eventually those hardy suckers are going to die off too. And, a little bit more activity from that low a cell density in your mead isn't going to make much of a difference. However, if you leave a lot of residual sugar, or if you backsweeten, and that then adds more fermentable sugars, those super cells, well, they get all excited. And when they get all excited, not only do they continue to ferment, but they say, hey, everything just got cleaned up out here. We ought to reproduce. And they start budding. And so then you end up getting more yeast cells in a mead that you thought had been completely stabilized. Well, after you add the sugar, it might start cooking again. And
all it takes is one.
Well, yeah, it usually takes a little more than that, but, it's...
Given enough time.
Generally, they're asexual, so they reproduce from one, but it takes a lot of cycles to build up a yeast population to where it's going to do any measurable damage to the residual sugar in the mead. And usually they're so stressed by that point that they're on their last legs.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, if you throw a lot of, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. If you throw a lot of, finish your thought.
Yeah, if you throw a lot of sugar in there and you excite those guys and they start reproducing, then all of a sudden you could create re-fermentation in the bottle, and then you got a bottle bomb.
Yeah.
So, in meads that are going to be left with residual sugar, either naturally or through backsweetening, you want to take another step. Essentially, you want to add birth control chemical to your mead. And it works only on yeast.
Oh, darn. There's a whole
Yeah.
lot of disappointed female mead makers out there right now going, thought I found something there.
Yeah, but anyway, so the number 2 in this 1-2 punch then is that after you've done the first step of chemical stabilization with the sulfur dioxide, then you add potassium sorbate. Potassium sorbate, once it dissolves in the mead in liquid form, creates sorbic acid, and sorbic acid, fortunately for us, completely inhibits cell division in yeast. And so even if you got a few cells that survived the onslaught of the SO2, when they get exposed to that sorbate, they're just basically going to sit there until they die a natural death. They're not going to reproduce, and you're not going to have any problems with excessive fermentations going on in the bottle.
I'm sorry, my mental image is a bunch of little yeasties in little rocking chairs going, oh, I'm just so done here.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. There's after that step, there is no yeast Viagra. It's over.
Okay.
Yeah,
Who
my
knew
roommate always
that
used to,
stabilization was funny, right?
my roommate always
really.
used to joke that it makes their little pizzles fall off.
Oh gosh, that's hilarious. Okay, so